My typical greeting when I am invited to speak is good morning. And for the last 2 weeks, I have removed the good. So I will say to you, morning. It is actually genuinely a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'm grateful for Richard Flory, for the Center, for USC, and for all of you for coming and braving traffic to be here. We live in remarkable and strange times. We're just 2 weeks out from what I think might be the most consequential election in U.S. history. And I live in Maryland, and as I've been out at sporting events with my children in the past couple weeks or talking to neighbors, I find people are hesitant to speak about this election, hesitant to acknowledge how they voted, hesitant to engage with the perils that are facing our society. So perhaps things are different here in California, but at any rate, I don't see any reason to mince words today. I'm not going to pull my punches. I'm going to be direct, if that's okay. You're welcome to disagree with me. I'm fine with that, and you can push back during the Q&A or come up to me and give me an earful over lunch. That's totally fine. But I think this remarkable time we are living in requires some forthrightness and some clarity. Our present quandary is that American Christianity is shrinking rapidly. You have two charts here, one from the Pew Research Center. They're also using data from the General Social Survey that shows up until 1990, about 90% of Americans identified as Christian. And then it suddenly, at the very end of the Cold War there, starts to precipitously drop off throughout the 90s down to today around 63, 64%, depending on who is asking the question and which survey you're looking at. Frankly, almost 1/3 of American Christians melted away in the past 35 years. The green chart is Gallup. They're tracking church membership. It's also mosque and synagogue membership, but that's only about 2 to 3% of the total. And for the first time in 2020, it dropped down below 50%, down to 47% for the first time in the history of the survey. American Christianity is shrinking rapidly, and so many American Christians are scared. They're scared of persecution. They're scared of losing their cultural power. They're scared of changing demographics. They're scared of their children leaving the church because their children are leaving the church. And the list could go on. There's a survey here from the National Association of Evangelicals. They conducted it in 2016. They said most evangelical leaders expected persecution. 32% of the sample said that they had been persecuted. 76% said they were expecting to be persecuted in the coming years. If you want to understand why Trump was elected in 2016 with 81% support from white evangelicals, I suggest you start there. There's also a Lifeway survey here from 2023. 69% of Protestant pastors said they believe there is a growing sense of fear within their congregations. Lifeway found that 63% of surveyed Protestant pastors said their churches also have a similar increasing dread, specifically about the future of Christianity in the U.S. and around the world. American Christianity is shrinking. American Christians are scared. And therefore, many American Christians are angry and indignant. They're indignant at cultural decay. They're angry at losing their cultural power. They're angry at expanding LGBTQ rights. They're angry at abortion. They're angry at liberals, and the list could go on. I'm sure this isn't news to anyone here as leaders in American Christianity, but maybe we'll just do a show of hands. How many of you have seen an increase in anger and indignation in your congregation in the last 5 years? More than a handful. I think the COVID crisis really amplified this, bringing Christians' fears to the very surface. And so because of these things, this makes American Christians magnetized to theologies of power and supremacy. If you need evidence of this, I'd suggest looking at the Public Religion Research Institute survey that they just released a couple months ago in September 2024 called One Leader Under God, the Connection Between Authoritarianism and Christian Nationalism in America. The survey shows that Christian identity, especially Protestant identity, and church attendance is highly correlated across ethnic groups, with scoring high on Christian nationalism, having strong sympathies with right-wing authoritarianism, and with political radicalization. That's just a small part of this growing literature on Christian radicalization in the United States. And I'm sure that some of you just heard me use that word radicalization and thought, come on, Matt, we're talking about Christians here, not terrorists. We talk a lot about Christian nationalism these days, but I don't think we're very precise when we do. We often talk about it as though it's a monolithic thing, but the reality is it's a spectrum. On the soft end of the spectrum, on the moderate end of the spectrum, Christian nationalism tends to be more passive, more sentimental, more democratic. These are the God bless America kind of Christian nationalists, represented by an American flag and alongside a Christian flag at the front of the church. Now, it's not my cup of tea. I would not prefer not to have national symbols in the front of my worship service, but it's not a grave threat to American democracy either. Now, at the more hardline end of the spectrum, we find ideologies that are more organized, more anti-democratic, and more theological. And here's the irony. The more theology you introduce into your Christian nationalism, the more hardline it will become. I call this end of the spectrum Christian supremacy. And there you see an American flag and a Christian flag on the front lines of the riots on January 6th. That is a grave threat to American democracy. And the challenge is that soft Christian nationalists and hardline Christian nationalists and Christian supremacists might vote along similar lines, but what distinguishes them is the severity of the perceived threat and their willingness to overturn the current system by violence if necessary to see Christianity enshrined in the American government. And so when we talk about radicalization within American Christianity, it's about people moving further along this spectrum from the, I get asked a question on a survey, and is America a Christian nation? Oh, sure, I like that idea, to I need to make it one. It's my job to do this. And the lost cause narrative of Trump's 2020 election denial, and if you know your American history, that phrase, lost cause, is important, is radicalizing many Christian nationalists. It's generating mass conspiracy theories in our society. It's creating epistemic discombobulation. People don't know even what they know. They don't trust their sources of information, and it's leading to more and more violent and anti-democratic organizing. January 6th is an open wound in our body politic. We've not allowed it to heal because we've not faced it. And this problem, I predict, will only get worse if and when Trump pardons the January 6th participants, as he has promised to do, legitimizing their violence and creating the official narrative that what they did was righteous, or at least understandable. So what does American Christian supremacy look like today? I would argue that there are two major brands of this, at least on the Protestant side. The Catholic side is much more complicated. The first brand is what we could call the Reformed Reconstructionist Gradualists. This is a movement that emerges in the 1960s and 1970s, centered around the theologians R.J. Rushdoony and his son-in-law Gary North. Rushdoony was here in California. They were very influential, though subterranean in their influence, on the rise of the religious right in the 1980s. These guys are not popular among Christian audiences, but they're very popular among Christian leaders. They're very widely read. And so they offered a kind of intellectual and cerebral framework, a theological framework for the rise of the religious right in the 1980s. And this is very much wrapped up with their understanding of Calvinism. So this is why we talk about Reformed, right? That's a synonym for Calvinism generally. And so the idea is they want to reconstruct society around their vision of things. And this is where they created this concept of dominion theology. And I'll lay that out in a minute. But they also embraced a gradualist vision of what they called theonomy. Theo, God, nomos, law. The application of biblical law to modern societies. And they wanted to implement this over generations. They had this very long-term plan. Now, what does this look like today? Where might you encounter this? Well, here's a sample from Stephen Wolfe's book, A Case for Christian Nationalism, which came out in 2022. Stephen Wolfe, by the way, not a fringe figure. He wrote at least part of this book, and in fact, I believe most of it, doing a postdoctorate at Princeton University. He is not a stupid man. This is what he writes in The Case for Christian Nationalism. Non-Christians living among us are entitled to justice, peace, and safety, but they are not entitled to political equality. nor do they have a right to deny the people of God their right to order civil institutions to God and to their complete good. We lack the spirit for this sort of dominion today, a once uncontroversial spirit that animated the magisterial Protestant reformers and Christians prior to the Reformation. He's literally saying this is a medieval worldview. We must revitalize and return to it. The Christian's posture toward the earth ought to be that it is ours, not theirs, for we are co-heirs with Christ. In the moderate range, this Reconstructionist Christian supremacy can look like theobros, if you're familiar with that term, the seminarians with the big beards that like to argue on Twitter, at least like to argue with me. They have these big bearded men's conferences with titles like Blueprints for Christendom 2.0. Christendom, if you're not familiar with it, another medieval concept, is the physical land ruled over by Christian monarchs, the boundaries, the geographical boundaries of Christian dominance. In the extreme range, these Reconstructionist types can look like endorsing racism, which Wolff walks right up to the edge of doing in his book. He says, birds of a feather flock together. I'm not sure interracial marriage is such a good thing. This is mainstream Calvinist theology right now. They often are justifying slavery as a God-ordained order. It might not be needed today, but we can't discount it. Justifying the Crusades as a template for civilizational conflict, including the nominee for the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Calling for the end of women voting. This is mainstream in these circles today. And more recently, you can observe them starting to play footsie with Nazism, outright Nazism. Now, the second brand of Christian supremacy is what we could call the independent charismatic accelerationist brand. And this is what Richard was gesturing towards. And since the rise of Pentecostalism in the early 1900s, often attached here in LA, there's always been this non-denominational sector of Pentecostalism. And in the 1960s and 1970s, also here in California, you had the Jesus People revivals that flooded this non-denominational charismatic sector with people. Excited people, energetic people. And it was also in the 1970s through the 1990s that some of these dominion theology ideas started to cross over and cross-pollinate from the Reconstructionists into these independent charismatic networks and started being adopted and rebranded within that space. So these folks are not so much into the gradualism, reforming society over generations. They talk about an immediate supernatural transformation of society through revival and reformation. That's their catchphrase. So what does this look like today? Well, I'm sure many of you have seen it. It's these ecstatic, high-energy worship services at places like Bethel Church in Redding, California. Lots of talk of revival, talk of conquering spiritual territory. There's this highly networked leadership culture that Richard was speaking about. And they see taking over local politics and school boards and city councils as a divine mandate. This is what God is calling them to do, to take over their locality. Huge swaths of the apostolic and prophetic, sometimes called the New Apostolic Reformation, the Messianic Jewish, and the Word of Faith, the prosperity gospel movements have been taken over by these dominion theology ideas. And so what it has shaped is a multi-ethnic and entrepreneurial class of independent charismatic celebrity preachers, apostles, prophets, revivalists, televangelists, and worship leaders who have wrapped themselves around Donald Trump and become his most ardent defenders. In fact, the lion's share of his evangelical advisors come out of these spaces. In the moderate range, this can look like the Seven Mountains ideology. The idea that you divide society up into these 7 different arenas of influence, and Christians need to conquer all of them and let Christian influence flow down from the top. It can look like politicized revival sessions around people like Sean Foyt. It can look like appeal to heaven flags, and if you're not familiar with that, I can talk more about it in the Q&A. In the extreme range, this can look like the Capitol rioters. In fact, the majority of Christians, as far as I can tell, who showed up in D.C. on January 6th were followers of this crowd. These movements are also increasingly cross-pollinating with militia movements, where we see these far-right militias getting baptized into this charismatic spiritual warfare theology. In fact, I've been tracking from Maryland a pastor and a church in Pomona, California, where the pastor is a Proud Boy. And he holds revival services, baptizing his fellow Proud Boys. They're not repenting of being Proud Boys. They're being baptized as Proud Boys, affirmed as Proud Boys. So, how does this Christian supremacist theology work? And I'm gonna walk you through the charismatic style of it. You could do a similar thing with the Reformed folks. And since I'm going to very severely critique this theology because I find it abhorrent, I'm going to try to recount it as neutrally as possible in their own terms right now, just so you get a sense of their logic. And a lot of this I'm taking from C. Peter Wagner's book, Dominion, but I'm adding in a few other sources as well. So their theology begins in Genesis 1. God created the earth, and they would even say God created the earth as a colony of heaven. God made humanity to have dominion over the earth. And they connect that back to Revelation 22, where you see the people of God ruling with God. Now, the way they read Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve fall, they would say they not only sinned, they not only introduced sin, they gave up their dominion. They were given free will, they were given dominion, Satan stole their dominion, and now Satan rules over all the kingdoms of this world, Matthew chapter 4. So when Jesus comes and founds his church, and they're very fond of this term ecclesia, and they use it, if you're familiar with the Greek, ecclesia means assembly. And they'll say, in the same way that we talk about a state assembly, the ecclesia is the true government on the earth. It's the colonizing government on the earth. It's God's colonizing government to prevail over Satan and to restore the dominion of heaven. And they very much focus on Matthew chapter 16. The gates of hell will not prevail over Christ's ecclesia. Now they say Jesus died in Luke 19 to seek and save that which was lost. That is dominion. Not those who were lost, that which was lost. And so Jesus restores dominion through his life. And then Jesus, after his resurrection, commissions his ecclesia to disciple nations. Note the reinterpretation of the Great Commission, not to disciple the people, the ethne of the world, but to disciple nations. This is a pretty radical reinterpretation of the Great Commission. The nation itself, society, becomes the object of Christian mission, not the people, the nation. And as far as I can tell, this is a place where the Reconstructionists actually very much agree with the charismatic folks. And they would say that the ecclesia will ultimately rule and reign with Christ, so the church must defeat Satan and bring every culture under God's dominion, Revelation chapter 5. And if you're thinking, Matt, I have never heard of this. This is bizarre. I don't know why you're recounting this. Lance Wallnau tweeted this last night. Lance Wallnau is Donald Trump's most effective Christian propagandist. He is at Mar-a-Lago right now, lobbying along with all the other hangers-on, trying to get his agenda pushed through. And he has direct connections into Trump. He says, he posted this last night, "We are in a unique moment of redefining how the ecclesia engages the process of national reformation. Revival is a personal encounter. Reformation is institutional. If you want to restrain lawlessness as a spirit, you need to cast it out of its institutional strongholds. Demons are cast out of people, but principalities are cast out of the institutions that house them. It's a much bigger battle. Ideologies lodge in the high places on top of the mountains of influence." He's the one who came up with the 7 mountains, by the way. "They derive their strength through the power of agreement. That power was dealt a massive blow on November 5th, but intercession and human agency is needed to complete the Reformation process." Trump is the agent of reformation in their theology. This is the theology of ardent Christian Trumpism that would make Trump a divinely anointed authoritarian over the United States. This is the theology of January 6th that would overthrow a democratic election to enact God's will as they understand it. This theology slanders God the Father of Jesus Christ as a petty tyrant and a colonizer. This is Antichrist theology that casts Jesus as a heavenly Caesar and an imperial prince. And this theology blasphemes the Holy Spirit. Go and read Mark chapter 3. By attributing to God's Spirit the agenda of Satan holding human beings under domination. This theology is seeping in at the edges of our churches. It's the theology of the imminent regime. So how do we preach against it? What I'd like to offer you this morning in the remainder of our time is not a sermon outline, but instead a lens, a way of thinking about the biblical text that you may have encountered before, but I'd like to dial in on a particular text. I want to look at the theme of imperial power in the Gospel of Mark. So it's not a sermon outline. I want to give you a way of reading with the grain of the text. I would suggest that you could do similar exegetical work with most of the other New Testament texts, but with Mark, it's right there on the surface. Mark, I think, is one of the most subtle and brilliant of the biblical authors, inserting and encoding this shrewd anti-imperial, anti-Caesar polemic within the story of the life of Jesus. So at first, we need to understand Mark's context. Mark, whoever Mark is writing this text in the midst of the first Judean revolt and the destruction of the Second Temple, roughly between the years 66 and 73 CE, roughly 35 to 40 years after the death of Jesus. In 66 CE, the Zealots, we find them occasionally mentioned in the Gospels, right? Simon the Zealot, one of Jesus' apostles. The Zealots, this kind of proto-nationalist Judean group, ignites a full-fledged rebellion against the Roman Empire in 66 CE in Galilee, in Jesus' home country, against Rome. And as there's this uprising, this Judean revolt, it spreads into Judea. The Sadducees and the priests join in the efforts of this rebellion. And Rome sends its legions of armies, as they always do, to put down the rebellion. And in 70 CE, the Roman legions lay siege to Jerusalem and ultimately slaughter thousands of Jews when they break through the city walls. Josephus, a contemporary historian of the time, says that 1.1 million people are killed in and around the temple in the siege of Jerusalem. So you have here the image, a painting of this brutal siege of Jerusalem. But we also have how the Romans themselves memorialized this conquest on the Arch of Titus in Rome, where you see Roman soldiers carrying away the sacred objects from the temple. This is Rome celebrating its domination. This, the destruction of the Second Temple, the siege of Jerusalem, was the cataclysm of Mark's era. This was the upheaval that changed the entire world for him and for his community. And Mark, we know this because in Mark 13, Jesus is giving this apocalyptic discourse towards the end of the gospel. And he says, "But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains." Jesus didn't have readers. Jesus was speaking. It was an oral sermon. Mark has readers. The parenthetical is Mark. Mark is stepping into Jesus' text, into Jesus' speech and saying, pay attention to this part. This is what's going on right now. This is what's happening now. We don't know if this is written before or after the destruction of the temple, but Mark is very clearly calling our attention to that destruction of the temple. The other context we need to understand here is the context of the Roman Empire and its colonial powers. The Roman Empire was neither a distant nor a humane regime to first century Palestinian Jews. We know from Josephus and other sources that the Romans would crucify thousands of people. There's nothing unique about the death of Jesus from the Roman perspective. Crucifixions served as billboards for the Roman Empire, and the translation was, F around and find out. Speak up, we'll show you. Rome was a culture built around enslavement and conquest. Roughly a third of the population of the Roman Empire was slaves. In fact, historians estimate that there have only been a handful of real slave societies in human history. There's been slavery throughout human history in many, many different civilizations and societies. But slave societies built around slavery, where slavery structured the daily lives and relationships of just about everyone in the empire, it's only happened a handful of times in human history. One was the antebellum South in the United States, and one was the Roman Empire. Most people in the Roman Empire lived in abject poverty, barely able to get enough calories to feed themselves and their families, while Rome taxed and taxed and taxed the colonized to keep wealth flowing up to the elite oligarchs and to Caesar himself. This is the daily reality of Jesus and everyone in his world. And it's the sort of thing that we have to go back and read into the text because they just assume it. It's like if you're trying to write an email to your friend about your day living in Southern California. You don't say, well, I spent 3 hours on the 5 today, and there were helicopters and planes flying over me, and there were big buildings around me. Your friend knows all that. Get to the important part. In the text of the Bible, this is the assumed daily experience of the people, colonized by Rome. And the Roman propaganda of this era called this the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Empires are rarely gifted with irony. You are dominated, so you have peace. You're welcome. Mark, in his brilliance, structures the entire book, the entire 16 chapters in what's called a chiasm, if you're not familiar with the concept. A chiasm is a structured way of writing, very common in the ancient world. In fact, in the same way that we think in terms of kind of a 5-paragraph essay or a 3-point sermon, that is how people in the ancient world thought and wrote, was in chiasms. And a chiasm is structured like a hamburger. You've got bun on the outsides, condiments, and then there's the meat. And the question when you encounter a chiasm in the text is always, where's the beef? What's the hamburger? What's the center of this thing? Because that is what is being emphasized. We tend to think in terms of what's the introduction and conclusion. They think what's in the center, what's in the middle. And this chiasm begins in the first chapter, or the first verse of the first chapter of Mark, where he introduces it and says, the good news, the euangelion of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then through the rest of the first half of the book, it's structured around these 3 crossings of the sea with Jesus and his disciples. And the question that drives the first half of the book of Mark is, who is Jesus? And in each of the 3 crossings of the sea, we learn more about Jesus, right? And the first one is where they're in the boat and Jesus is asleep and he rebukes the wind. And the disciples say, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? The second one is Jesus walking on water, and the disciples can't comprehend. And the third one, Jesus warns them about the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod, and the stupid disciples think that he's talking about bread. But then we come to the center of the chiasm in chapter 8 with Peter's confession, right? Jesus, who do the people say that I am? And who do you say that I am? You are the Christ. That is the center. That's the hamburger of Mark. But then immediately, Jesus says, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone that. Why? Why at the center? Why when you've revealed the truth? Why is it then hidden again? Well, that's when we get to the second half of the book, where the driving question is, what is the Christ? What is this idea of the Christ? And in the same way that you have the 3 crossings of the sea in the first half, Jesus offers 3 predictions of his own passion and suffering in the second half, again, revealing more and more about what it means to be the Christ. And it ends, the chiasm ends, with the declaration of the centurion after the crucifixion and death of Jesus. Surely, truly, this man was God's son. Echoing, if you note, the first verse. The Son of God, truly this man was God's son. That's the only time that title occurs in Mark, is those 2 spots. Jesus' identity in Mark is not cerebral or propositional. It's not something you need to say the right words, because you can say the right words and misunderstand. You can say Christ but not know. You can say Son of God but not understand. The identity of Jesus is experiential and confessional. Mark's goal is not to teach us doctrine, not here are the things you must say. It's about unlearning our assumptions and then relearning, emptying out the titles and the assumptions that we bring about God, and then filling it with new meaning through the encounter with Jesus. And the central theme of Jesus' identity, the one that is the structure of this entire book, is built around an implicit and even sometimes explicit contrast between Jesus and Caesar. So I'm going to walk you through 4 moments of this contrast, this theme of Jesus versus Caesar. And it begins there in that first verse. chapter 1, verse 1. Mark uses this term euangelion, which we translate as gospel. Now, Mark is almost certainly the first of the gospels that is written. He is the one who brings this term gospel into the Christian tradition. Matthew and Luke and John are cribbing from Mark. But Mark didn't make up this word. This word was in use by the Caesars. This was an imperial word. So when Mark writes the beginning of the good news, the euangelion of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, we know from archaeology, we found the inscriptions in the Mediterranean world. This is one from Eastern Turkey from about 8 years before the birth of Jesus. Whereas the providence, which has regulated our whole existence, has brought our life to the climax of perfection in giving us the Emperor Augustus, whom providence has filled with virtue, and the word there means power, for the welfare of humankind, being sent to us and our descendants as our Savior, has put an end to war, Pax Romana, and put all things in order. And whereas, having become God manifest, Caesar has fulfilled all the hopes of earlier times. And whereas the birthday of the god, Augustus, has been for the whole world the beginning of the euangelion concerning him, therefore let a new era begin from his birth. This is what the word euangelion meant in Mark's world. It's a declaration of the gospel of Caesar. But Mark is coming back and inserting Jesus into the euangelion. Jesus is the actual God manifest. Jesus is the anti-Caesar, the un-Caesar, the real Son of God, the bringer of true good news. Mark is exposing the lie of Caesar's euangelion and pointing us to the gospel of Jesus. Jesus' identity has to be mystified and secretive in the text of Mark, because if you mistake Jesus for Caesar, you'll never understand Jesus. Skipping over the first half, because we don't have that much time, I'd love to go through the whole thing. But we come to chapter 10, the passage we were just discussing earlier. This is coming right in the middle of the third passion prediction. So Jesus is filling their minds with a new understanding of Christ. In the context, he says, or Mark gives us the account here, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. And then James and John come and make their request, and then Jesus brings it back. You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them, Caesar. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be the slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Mark is very clear, and I think we need to be very clear in our preaching, that it is the Romans, it is the Gentiles, it is the colonial regime of Caesar, not the Jews, that killed Jesus. The anti-Caesar threatens Caesar the tyrant. Jesus was not killed by the Jews. Jesus was killed by the empire that was threatened by him. You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. Jesus is calling attention, right? The passion predictions are about pointing people to the crucifixion. What Jesus is preaching is an upside-down kingdom of God. And I think we sometimes need to put the words kingdom in quotes until we fill it with new meaning. The Son of God came not to dominate, but to be human, to serve humans, and to die a human ransom. Our King suffers for us. Caesar makes us suffer. Our King suffers for us. Heaven is not a dictatorship. It's not a top-down system of cosmic repression. This is what Christian supremacy gets wrong. The kingdom of God is a kingdom that is far stranger and further from our human apprehensions and assumptions. and we have to retrain ourselves to understand it. Skipping ahead 2 chapters, we come to the famous passage about render unto Caesar. And as the context, if you remember, it's Passion Week. The Pharisees and the Herodians, strange bedfellows, are trying to entrap Jesus. The Pharisees are the pious religious leaders of the countryside, the populists, but they're also intellectual righteous ones. They're trying to embody this kind of piety in the midst of empire. And the Herodians are the colonial compromisers, the ones who are the cynical scrappers who are willing to work with the Romans. They're the supporters or maybe the family members of Herod, this oligarchic, crass group of elites. What are they doing together? Why are the Pharisees and Herodians attacking and going after Jesus? They are both threatened by the upside-down kingdom. And so they come to Jesus and they ask, is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? In translation, and this is the daily quandary of the colonized, will you cower before the colonizers? Will you pay them their share? Or will you rebel and be killed and end up on a cross? Jesus knows where he's going. This is the 3rd time he's told them he's going to a cross. But Jesus zigs when they expect him to zag. And he says, show me the icon. Show me the image, right? Bring me the denarius, right? And this icon, this word in Greek, it's the likeness, the representation, the replication. And the denarius itself was a colonizing token with Caesar's image on it. This one was probably still in circulation in Jesus' time, but some also had Augustus' stepson Tiberius on them. And it says on one side, Augustus Caesar, on the other side, Divine Julius. Caesar's image on his colonizing token binds the denarius to him. The denarius is Caesar's euangelion in miniature. It stands for Caesar's whole regime of oppression and domination and enslavement. And the typical Christian interpretations of this passage are either pay your taxes or give the government its due. But given all the context, I think that Mark's and actually Jesus' message is quite different. I think he is saying something far more radical and provocative. He's not saying pay your taxes. He's saying put Caesar back in his place. He may rule you, he may dominate you, he may pillage you, but he is no God. He's just a petty tyrant. Jesus is basically saying, you mean Caesar, the coin guy? Give him back his coin. You bear the image of God. Render yourself back to God. We human beings are not colonizing tokens. Humans, all humans bear the image, the icon of God, and nothing else reflects God like humanity. If you don't hear the echoes of Genesis 1 here, you can't understand what Jesus is saying. Caesar's system, his regime of power and domination is built around violence and exploitation and dehumanization and colonization, and his icons, the denarii, are the lifeblood of that system. But what is missing from Caesar's regime is humanity, the recognition of the basic dignity of humanity. I think Jesus is saying, if I may be so bold, he's saying Jesus, his entire Jewish family, his neighbors, his disciples, and yes, the rest of us, we are hopelessly enmeshed in the kingdoms of this world. We will be taxed, we will be beaten, we will be commodified, and we will be colonized. But we can be the most subversive of all. We can serve. We can become the slave of all like Jesus. We can live humanely and humanly from the margins by a set of values that defy the very premise of Caesar's reign. We humanize the victims of empire by imitating Jesus. This is the threat to Caesar's regime and also those of the Pharisees and the Herodians. This is what gets Jesus killed because Jesus and the Jesus community is indomitable. We live by a different kingdom that is not premised on domination, but on love, not on power, but on sacrifice. And we defy the lords of the Gentiles, the worldly kings who overtax and crush and objectify us when we imitate Jesus. We become his icons in the world when we live the upside-down kingdom, the sacrificial reign of God. And we come to the end of the chiasm, the end of this section, chapter 15, the declaration by the centurion, and it's important to see the context. So we find out in verse 25, it was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews," and with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left, and those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads. And Mark goes on to describe how it's the passersby and then the chief priests and the scribes and the crucified bandits, all the bystanders, they all mock Jesus. There's no memory in Mark's gospel of a bandit or a thief speaking to Jesus and asking to enter the kingdom. Everyone mocks Jesus on the cross. And then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." The first sentence of Mark declares that Jesus is the Son of God, but that title, again, does not occur again in the text until the centurion speaks it after Jesus' death. The one slight exception is the demons. In chapter 5, the legion, note that word, right? In the Gerasene demoniac, talk about Jesus as the Son of the Most High. That word legion is not accidental. It's a Roman military term. The kingdom, the dark kingdom of the demons, the military forces of the Shadow Empire reflect the colonizing forces of Rome. And the Gerasene demoniac becomes one of the great heroes of the Gospel of Mark. And what the centurion says is, truly, truly, surely, the centurion, this imperial agent of Caesar, is the first one who fully recognizes the truth of Jesus' euangelion and the falsehood of Caesar's. This is the brute. This is the man, the executioner who was hired by Caesar, by the empire, to keep down the Judean colony. And he is the one who realizes and confesses Jesus not in his glorification, but in his mortification. Not in Jesus lording it over his fellow human beings, but in his enacting of the sacrificial reign of God. Rome trembles before the crucified. And Caesar's most potent act of humiliation and dehumanization through crucifixion boomerangs back and hits the centurion with the beauty of the upside-down kingdom. So to summarize, to know Jesus as Lord is to downgrade all human supremes. Caesar may have his cross, his whip, his sword, his taxation, his propaganda, his Project 2025, but Caesar has no claim on me. The me that is God's image does not cower before his implements of war and desecration. To follow Jesus is to defy the deified empire. The empowering call of Jesus is not fight, 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 but serve, serve, serve. We serve not Caesar, but human beings who bear the icon of God. And we are agents of humanization and kindness because there is no more countercultural value system than love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And following Jesus should always be costly because it bucks against the systems of domination of our world. So, to conclude, Christian supremacy is just another in a long line of bad, as in unworthy of Christ, but popular theologies of Christian empowerment. For centuries, Christians have longed to be empowered, but we don't need empowerment. The Pharisees, the populist religious leaders, and the Herodians, the cynical political scrappers, are plotting together again. They're hanging out at Mar-a-Lago right now. Christian imperialism is back. And the Gospel of Mark offers us a treasury of subversive anti-imperial theology for our time. So let me close with a plea to you, my fellow Christians and leaders of the American church. Resist the siren song of Christian supremacy in your churches. It is time for Christians to renounce the lords of the Gentiles in all their ways. And it is time to preach the evangelion of the upside-down kingdom of the God who serves and sacrifices and ransoms. Amen and amen. And just so we're clear on our terms, so supersessionism, it comes from the Latin to supersede, it's literally to sit on top of. And so that supersessionism emerges out of the Jewish-Christian conversation, right? And the idea, and this emerges in the early church, is that Christianity sits on top of Judaism. There are chairs. And this then leads to great dehumanization of Jews, and as part of the contributing theologies, the anti-Judaism, the tradition, the adversus Judaeos tradition that is the backstop of pogroms and anti-Semitism and ultimately the Holocaust. So yes, it's an important question. I think as I was trying to gesture towards, I think every time we talk about, I get this pushback a lot on Twitter, but Christ is supreme, right? I have to say, only if you mean it the right way. Only if you define Christ's supremacy through Christ's own behavior. Right? Because, and this is what these theologians get so wrong. They imagine that when Jesus comes back in Revelation, he's a different person. And Lance Wallnau will say this. He said this on his podcast the other day. It was a revelation to me. Jesus, when he came first, was sacrificial, and when he comes back, he dominates. And I have to say, that is horrible theology. That is a bastardization of the character of God. If God is actually who God is revealed to be in Jesus, which is the fundament of Christian theology, then the character of Jesus reflects the character of God. The values of Jesus reflect the values of God. Jesus is teaching us God because we don't know God apart from that. So yes, I would say our God is supreme and therefore sacrificial. Our God is supreme and therefore a servant. Now, if you want to get into the interreligious question about how does this relate to other religions, that's kind of a topic for another day, and I'm happy to get into it. That's what I do as my day job. But I would just say any theology that denigrates human beings is unworthy of God, unworthy of Christ. I would think of it this way. Think of it like a Venn diagram. So you have white supremacy, which is a very significant part of our culture and something that we have never figured out a way to root out of our culture. And then you have Christian supremacy, and they overlap, but they don't overlap perfectly. There are white supremacists who are not Christian. In fact, many white supremacists, because they actually read their Bible, are like, we don't want to be around Jesus. We like Odin. There's a whole cult of this Norse kind of mythological, like those are the real white gods. Jesus doesn't fit our kind of white supremacist imagination. Now, there are white supremacist Christians, and there's real overlap. And many of the people who are Christian supremacists are also white supremacists. But there are also Christian supremacists who are not white supremacists. And this is part of the challenge that we're facing right now is, and I have watched it happen even over the last 4 years, these theologies that originate often in white churches are spreading into non-white churches. And I talk to activists, including people on the ground here in California, who say, all this Christians against Christian nationalist stuff is good, but if you actually want that literature to reach anybody, it needs to be in Spanish, and Filipino, and Korean, because that's where we see this stuff spreading rapidly right now. The pastor, the Proud Boy pastor, he's Filipino-American. So today we have a multi-ethnic coalition. We have a multi-ethnic coalition of Christian supremacy in our country right now. And I think you could definitely argue that there is a whiteness that is embedded within that is being issued through that. I think that's a worthwhile conversation to have, but I think we need to deal with this multi-ethnicity of it, especially in this charismatic space. The Reformed Reconstructionist space is very, very white right? That's where you get the big bearded dudes. But the independent charismatic space is very multi-ethnic, and it's also global. It's transnational. So what we have right now are transnational networks of Christian supremacy that are and some of the same leaders, some of the same Christian leaders and organizations and networks that were heavily involved in the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot were heavily involved in the January 8th, 2023 Brasilia Capitol riots. These folks are against democracy overall, and they're linking up with authoritarian leaders around the world. Yeah, it's great. Very, very important question. I mean, if you go back to the era of European colonization, which is what our country was founded in, right? That is an era of Christian imperialism. And the slave trade, the attacks on Native Americans was all prosecuted under the heading of Christian theology, what I would call Antichrist theology. But it's using at least the rhetoric and symbolism of the Christian tradition, right? And this is, I think, that what we have to reckon with is these people are Christians. They're bad Christians, but they're Christians. They're not necessarily heretics. And we, the people in this room, Christians in America, we need to be able to have this theological fight, because our secular and our Muslim and our Hindu and our Buddhists and our Jewish brothers and sisters, they don't speak this vocabulary. We speak the vocabulary. We speak theology. We need to have some theological arguments right now. But yes, this stuff is rooted very deep. And if you go back, and especially if you listen to the narratives of Christian nationalists, they don't just go back to the founding. They go back to the colonies. They go back to prayers that were prayed over Plymouth. They go back to prayers that were prayed over Jamestown. And they would say that those are the Christian foundations of our country. And so I think we need to detach our Americanism from our Christianity. There are wonderful things. I'm patriotic American, but I got to be honest about America, right? And what America has been and what has done. And I think I love Lincoln's phrasing of the better angels of our nature, because it's acknowledging the demons have often won out. Yeah. Why I wanted to hit this, because I think it is really, really important. Jesus is Jewish. Right. Not was Jewish. Jesus is Jewish. Right? That is incorporated into the very identity of God. And Jesus lived as a Jewish person in his own time. The reason he's talking about the lords of the Gentiles, he's not speaking to quote unquote Christians there. He's speaking to Jews. Right? And so I think we always need to read and understand Jesus within his context. Now, within the colonized context of first century Judea, yes, there were Jewish leaders who collaborated with the Roman Empire, especially the Sadducees and the Herodians. And this is where we hear about the chief priests and the scribes who plot against Jesus. And the Gospels handle that differently. Matthew handles it very differently than Mark or Luke. I would argue that Matthew has handled it in a way that has led to great pain for the Jewish people. But yeah, there were Jewish leaders who participated in Jesus' execution. Jews did not have the authority to execute people in the colonial empire. And I think we always have to read what is going on in the crucifixion of Jesus within the context of colonialism, right? Even the actors who are collaborating, the Jewish actors who are collaborating with the death of Jesus, are themselves colonized and are trying to preserve a certain amount of identity and integrity in the midst of colonization. Rome is the problem, and Rome is the one that executes Jesus. Were there Jewish people involved? Yes, but this is where we have done a very bad job in our Christian interpretive traditions of reading those passages in context and trying to transpose upon this and say, well, the Jews killed Jesus. No, they didn't. Jesus was Jewish, right? All of his followers were Jewish. Some Jewish leaders in Jesus' time participated in the death of Jesus. Yeah, but it was the Romans who did it. I think we need to be very careful in how we use the book of Revelation. There was a very, very, very long debate in the Christian tradition about whether the book of Revelation belongs in our Bibles. And even by the time of the Reformation, many of the reformers were saying, this is kind of a secondary text. So I think we need to be very cautious about, because again, this is the inversion that happens. When you read the Gospels through the lens of Revelation, you're going to come up with a tyrant Jesus. When you read Revelation through the lens of the Gospels, you recognize it's the same Jesus. It's the slaughtered lamb who comes and saves. It's the slaughtered lamb who judges. And I would say the Jesus that judges humanity is the Jesus that has lived as a human being. The Jesus that judges our sin is the Jesus who went to the cross for our sin. And if your God is not more merciful, more generous, more kind, and more forgiving than you are, you don't worship God. You worship an idol. Right? So, but we always want to, and I think this is why Mark is using the secrecy theme. Because we always want to impose upon God our human assumptions, and we have to be trained through experience and encounter with Jesus how to unlearn our human assumptions about God. Something deep inside us wants God to be a tyrant, and we have to be liberated of that. Are we out of time? Well, I'm glad you gave me a really easy question right at the very end here. No, the reality is that right now, not only is American society polarized, but the American church is heavily polarized. And that is aggravating the polarization of our society. And I would argue that the American church has not been this polarized theologically, regionally, epistemically, at the very way, how we know what we know, than it has ever been other than on the eve of the Civil War. And I think it is a time for confrontation. I think it is a time for us to go and read our Barth and our Bonhoeffer. It is time for us to go and read our liberation theologians. It is time for us to go and read our feminist and our womanist theologians. It is time for us to go and read our black theology. And I think it is time for us to learn from the great traditions of resistance in the Christian church. Because the reality is, the message I gave here is going to be unpopular in the church. And the church is moving their direction, not ours. And if we're going to bear witness to the gospel of the upside down kingdom, I think we are going to be doing that from the margins for the next 4 years and maybe for a lot longer than that. And I think we need to just embrace that, because we don't sit in the seat of power. And Christianity was best, though, when it's lived from the margins. And so I think we need to embrace that kind of marginalization, because Jesus was marginalized. And I think we need to hold up truth to power. And like I was saying at the end, Jesus understood that was costly. And Jesus lost followers. And Jesus lost friends. And it's a time for losing friends. So in terms of the two endings of Mark, the short one's the good one. The long one is the one that somebody made up. And if you read the longer ending of Mark, it's somebody tried to take the book of Acts, turn it into an exhortation from Jesus, and tack it onto the end of the Gospel of Mark, and it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit vocabulary-wise. It doesn't fit grammatically. Mark intended evidently to end it with the disciples being afraid to proclaim the message. And if you go back through the Gospel of Mark, that's a very, very deep theme in Mark, is this fear, right? And fear versus faith. And the fear of the disciples, I think Mark ends the way that it ends in order to provoke us and say, you're in the position of the disciples. You have this new message. Are you going to proclaim it? Because we know they did eventually, because we got it. But we're still in that position. And it's always going to be a fearsome thing to preach the gospel. Now, in terms of Benjamin Franklin, I think in many ways the founders of the United States were deeply, deeply flawed human beings with a very profound insight. And their very profound insight was that coming out of the religious wars of Europe, and coming out of the many, many failures and degradations of colonized Christianity, they wanted to separate religion and state. And this was a brilliant move on their part. And religion has flourished in the United States because of the separation of religion and state. But the founders were all they were trying to think a new thought in a moment that had not been thought before. And so the genius of even this idea of separation of church and state took several centuries to work itself out, even in our culture. I mean, up until the 1960s, there were still school-mandated prayers led by school officials, and school-mandated Bible reading led by teachers.
Okay, I was troubled by one of your slides. And at the end, it was like, fight, fight, fight. Jesus says, serve, serve, serve.
Yep.
And the issue of service. Now, I believe in service. I believe our church, I'm a pastor, our church does service work.
Yeah.
What troubles me, if we are looking at the challenges within our nation, even in leadership, regardless of the administration, the push to serve while others are fighting, I'm troubled by that. And let me tell you why. As a black woman, I don't have the privilege of serving my way out of a nation that doesn't respect my blackness.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't have that privilege. I don't have a privilege. Well, y'all just be nice and serve.
Yeah.
And don't fight back. There's great violence happening. And so to hear serve, don't fight, that troubles me. I couldn't agree with that at all. I was like, what? No, And not physical fight, but fight back against powers and principalities that even rise up in governments, local, local and federal and whatever else. So I just wanted to share that, but also to hear your thoughts on when you say serve.
Right. No, it is a very good question. I do not think service means passivity. Right? Service does not mean, oh, I'm just the servant and I let everybody walk all over me. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer has this very interesting delineation where he says there's basically three ways that the church can relate to an unjust government. One is we hold the mirror up and expose what the government is doing and the harm that it's doing. The second is we serve the victims of the unjust government and care for them, and through our witness to them, show the government. And he says, but sometimes it's not enough to serve the people being crushed under the wheels of the empire. Sometimes you have to throw something into the spokes of the wheel and disrupt the power of the empire. I would call that also service, though. I would say that is also service. Again, it's not about subversion in the sense of, not my president. It's subversion in the sense of saying, I refuse to accept the deification of this regime. I refuse to accept the baptism that people like Lance Wallnau are doing of this regime. Because for many Christians right now, Donald Trump has become a sort of dark messiah, and they will literally use those terms in reference to him. And so I think those of us who are bearing witness, and I think this is a time for arguments. This is not a time for gentle, peaceful dialogue, and that's why you didn't hear unity in my talk, because this is not really a time for unity, because there are certain things you can't be unified with. And so I think we need to be aware of I take your point as well. I think these things land differently in our kind of ethnic communities and the backgrounds of our communities, right? And I think I was especially directing that to my fellow white Christians, I think. And I think this is a time as well, I am frustrated with how many white Christians, liberal white Christians I've encountered in the last few months, who, as they have contemplated Donald Trump's victory and then in the aftermath of it, have made jokes about how they're moving out of the country. And I understand their jokes. but that comes from a place of privilege. And my response is, where's your patriotism? And who are you going to serve in the midst of this? Because there will be victims of this regime. And if we, the church, are either quiet or acquiescing, then I think that we have forsaken our duty in this time. Yep.
Thank you, Matt. Let's have a word, a hand.